Sawyer had lived in the same quiet neighborhood for 5 years, and not once had he cared about a moving truck pulling up to one of the houses down the street. But when he saw the U-Haul parked in front of the house next door, and a woman stepping out of the driver's seat with a messy bun and an oversized hoodie, something about her made him pause. She looked overwhelmed, her arms crossed as she surveyed the mountain of boxes on the sidewalk. Then, with a deep breath, she grabbed the heaviest one like she was determined to do it all herself. Sawyer wasn't the type to get involved in other people's business. He kept to himself, worked his job, fixed up his old truck on weekends, and didn't make a habit of introducing himself to strangers. But something about her, the way she struggled with that box, the way she muttered to herself when it nearly slipped, made him move before he could think. "Need a hand?" His voice came out steadier than he felt. She startled, spinning around so fast she nearly dropped the box. Up close, she was even prettier than he expected. Wide brown eyes, flushed cheeks, lips parted in surprise. "Oh, I mean, yeah, if you don't mind," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I didn't think anyone would be around." Sawyer shrugged, already taking the box from her arms. "It's a Saturday. You'll find out soon enough this neighborhood's quieter than a cemetery." She let out a short laugh. "Great. Just what I need." He raised an eyebrow. "That a good thing or a bad thing?" She hesitated, then shook her head with a small smile. "I think it's what I need right now." Sawyer didn't push. Instead, he nodded toward the open front door. "Where's this going?" "For now? Living room." He carried the box inside, and before he knew it, he was helping her with another. And another. What was supposed to be a quick favor turned into an afternoon of unpacking, arranging furniture, and navigating half-built shelves. Somewhere in the middle of it, he learned her name. "I'm Violet," she said, handing him a screwdriver while they tried to assemble an impossibly complicated coffee table. "Sawyer." She smiled. "Nice to meet you, Sawyer." He didn't say it back, but something in his chest tightened at the way his name sounded coming from her lips. By sunset, they had made significant progress. Most of the boxes were opened, the essentials were set up, and the place was starting to look less like a storage unit and more like a home. Violet collapsed onto the couch, sighing dramatically. "Okay. I officially owe you my life." Sawyer leaned against the armrest, smirking. "Bit dramatic, don't you think?" "Nope." She pointed at him. "I was fully prepared to suffer through this alone. You saved me." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You would have figured it out." "Maybe. But it would have been miserable." She looked at him, her expression softening. "Seriously. Thank you." Sawyer wasn't used to gratitude. Not like this. Not from someone who looked at him as if he'd done something that mattered. He cleared his throat, pushing himself up. "I should head out. Let you settle in." Violet sat up. "Wait, at least let me order us some food. It's the least I can do for all your help." He hesitated. He should say no. He should walk back to his house and pretend like today didn't feel different than any other Saturday. But then she smiled and he found himself sitting back down. "All right," he said. "But only because I'm starving." Violet grinned. "Good. Because I was going to insist." As she grabbed her phone to look up takeout options, Sawyer leaned back against the couch, stealing a glance at her. He had no idea why he had stayed to help her. He had no idea why he was still here. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like being alone. The scent of takeout filled Violet's new living room as she set the containers on the coffee table. Sawyer watched as she unwrapped a pair of plastic forks, her movements quick but careful, like she was used to doing things alone. His stomach tightened at the thought. She slid a container toward him and sat cross-legged on the couch, her posture finally relaxing. The weight of the day was beginning to settle, but she didn't seem in a hurry to end it. Neither was he. "So," she said between bites, "tell me something about this neighborhood. Something I wouldn't find out just by living here." Sawyer leaned back in his seat, considering. The old guy 2 houses down hands out full-sized candy bars on Halloween, but only if you compliment his lawn first. Violet let out a quiet laugh. "Noted." He took another bite, chewing thoughtfully before adding, "And the woman across the street? She bakes muffins every Sunday and leaves them on her porch for people to take. No one knows why." Violet arched an eyebrow. "Mysterious muffin lady. I like it." Sawyer shrugged. "They're good muffins." Silence settled between them for a moment, comfortable but weighted by something unspoken. He could feel her gaze lingering on him before she finally asked, "What about you?" He glanced up. "What about me?" She tilted her head slightly. "How long have you lived here?" 5 years. Do you like it? He hesitated. It's quiet. Her lips pressed together, as if she understood more than he was saying. Quiet can be good. He didn't ask why she needed quiet. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Instead, he changed the subject. What about you? What brought you here? She exhaled, setting her fork down. A fresh start. He didn't pry, but something in the way she said it made his chest tighten again. She must have noticed his expression, because she offered a small smile. I promise it's not as dramatic as it sounds. He wasn't sure he believed that, but he let it go. Their conversation shifted after that, drifting into safer territory. Movies, music, whether pineapple belonged on pizza. He learned she had a terrible habit of buying books she never finished, and she learned he had a truck that barely ran but that he refused to get rid of. Somewhere between laughter and another round of takeout, the night slipped away. When Sawyer finally stood to leave, he felt something unfamiliar, a reluctance to go. Violet walked him to the door, leaning against the frame as he stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the sky inked with stars. Thanks again, she said softly. He nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. Anytime. She hesitated before adding, I mean it. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Then, before either of them could say anything else, he nodded once and made his way home. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, his house felt emptier than it ever had before. Sawyer wasn't the kind of man who lingered on things. He worked with his hands, fixed what needed fixing, and didn't let his mind wander to places it didn't belong. But ever since that night in Violet's half-unpacked living room, he caught himself looking toward her house more than he should. At first, it was subtle. He glanced out his window when he heard a noise from next door. If her car pulled into the driveway, he'd take a second longer than necessary to check the time. He told himself it was simple curiosity. She was new. He was just making sure she settled in. But then he started noticing things. The way she'd sit on her porch steps in the morning with a cup of coffee, staring at the sky as if waiting for something. The way she sometimes stood at her kitchen window, lost in thought, her fingers tapping against the counter. One afternoon, he was out in his yard replacing a busted fence post when he heard her front door creak open. He didn't look right away, but when he finally did, he found her standing just outside, arms crossed, staring at her overgrown flower bed like it had personally offended her. She sighed, rubbing her temples, then turned abruptly and walked to the side of the house. A moment later, she reappeared with a pair of gardening gloves and a small shovel. Sawyer watched as she knelt in the dirt, determination written all over her face. She dug furiously, pulling at roots, tossing weeds into a pile beside her. But it was clear she had no idea what she was doing. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, exhaling sharply before setting down his tools. He should leave it alone, let her figure it out herself. But before he could stop himself, he was already moving. By the time he reached her yard, she was frowning at a stubborn patch of tangled vines. Those aren't weeds, he said. She jumped, spinning around. A streak of dirt ran across her cheek and her brow furrowed. Excuse me. He motioned toward the mess she'd made. Those vines. They're jasmine. You're ripping out something people pay good money to plant. She looked between him and the tangled stems in her hand, then groaned. Of course I am. Sawyer crouched beside her, brushing his fingers over the remaining vines. They'll grow back if you leave them be. Just need a little trimming, not a full excavation. Violet huffed, dropping the vines she had been about to rip out. I have no idea what I'm doing. He glanced at her, his lips twitching. Yeah, I figured. She nudged his shoulder with hers, shaking her head. You could have stopped me sooner, you know. Thought about it. But you looked determined. She made a face. More like desperate. He tilted his head, studying her. Why the sudden interest in gardening? She hesitated, rubbing her hands together. I guess I wanted to make it look like someone actually lives here. Something in her voice made him pause. There was weight behind her words, something unsaid. He didn't push. Instead, he picked up the small shovel she'd abandoned. Well, if you're serious about fixing this place up, you're gonna need better tools. Violet narrowed her eyes. Are you saying my $5 gardening set isn't cutting it? I'm saying it's a miracle you haven't broken that thing in half yet. She laughed then, a real, unguarded laugh. It did something to him. He cleared his throat, standing. I've got some tools in my shed. If you want, I can show you how to do this right. For a moment, she just looked at him. Then slowly she smiled. Yeah, I'd like that. Sawyer didn't understand why he was doing this. Why he kept finding reasons to be around her. But as they worked side by side, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard, he decided he didn't need an answer. For now, it was enough just to be here. The days slipped into an easy rhythm. Violet's garden transformed under Sawyer's quiet guidance, and she threw herself into the work with a kind of determination he recognized but couldn't quite name. Every afternoon, he found himself at her side, teaching her how to coax life back into the neglected soil, showing her the difference between what needed to be cut away and what deserved a second chance. She learned quickly, faster than he expected. It wasn't just the plants she was determined to fix, he could see it in the way she tackled everything in her new home. She repainted the front door a deep green, replaced the weathered porch light, rearranged her furniture again and again until she was finally satisfied. But it wasn't just the changes in her house that made Sawyer notice her in a way he had been trying to avoid. It was her presence. The way she filled the space around her with warmth and restless energy. One evening, after spending the afternoon repairing the trellis that lined her yard, Violet leaned against the fence, looking at the sky. The last light of the day painted the horizon in soft golds and purples, and for a moment, they stood in comfortable silence. Then, without looking at him, she spoke. I used to have a place like this once. Sawyer turned toward her, waiting. She exhaled, running her fingers along the wooden post. Not exactly like this. It was smaller, but it had a little garden. I loved it. His voice came quieter than he intended. What happened? She hesitated, then gave him a small, wry smile. Life. He didn't push. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she had left behind, she wasn't ready to say it all yet. And he wasn't the kind of man who asked for more than someone was willing to give. Instead, he nodded toward the garden bed they had just finished planting. This one's yours now. She turned her head toward him and something unreadable passed through her expression. Then, before he could make sense of it, she looked away. That night, as he walked back to his own house, he caught himself glancing at her porch. The light was still on, casting a soft glow against the dark. Something about that made it harder to turn away. Days folded into weeks, and without Sawyer realizing it, Violet became a fixture in his life. He never sought her out deliberately, but somehow she was always there on her front porch, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, in her yard, kneeling in the dirt, determined to make something grow. He told himself it was nothing. That the way his feet carried him next door without a second thought wasn't deliberate. That the way his chest tightened when she really laughed was just a passing feeling. But it wasn't. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, he found her struggling with a stubborn hinge on her back gate. She was perched on a small stool, wrench in hand, muttering under her breath. He could have ignored it, could have kept walking. Instead, he found himself leaning against the fence, arms crossed. That gate giving you trouble? Violet glanced up, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face. It hates me. Sawyer crouched beside her, taking the wrench from her grasp. He tested the hinge, listening to the way it groaned under pressure. It's rusted through. You're gonna need a new one. She exhaled in frustration, sitting back on her heels. Figures. Everything in this house is either broken or barely holding on. There was something in her voice, something beyond the frustration of a busted hinge. It was exhaustion, the kind that ran deep. Without thinking, Sawyer reached out, brushing dirt from her hand. You've fixed a lot already. She looked at him then, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. Then, as if realizing how close they were, she pulled back, clearing her throat. Guess I'll add it to the list. Sawyer didn't move right away. He could still feel the warmth of her skin, the way her fingers had tensed beneath his touch. But he let it go. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind tangled with thoughts he could no longer ignore. He wanted her, not in the fleeting way he had wanted things before. This was different. It was slow and steady, like the way roots took hold beneath the earth. And it terrified him. The next day, he avoided her. Not in an obvious way, he still nodded when they crossed paths. Still answered when she called his name, but he didn't linger. Didn't let himself get pulled into the easy rhythm they had fallen into. But Violet noticed. She caught him outside his garage, wiping grease from his hands after working on his truck. She didn't hesitate, stepping into his space like she belonged there. "You're avoiding me." Sawyer froze, his jaw tightening. "I've been busy." Violet crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Liar." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Violet." "Don't do that," she interrupted. "Don't pull away without telling me why." He exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his workbench. "Because you make me feel things I shouldn't." The words were out before he could stop them. Violet's breath hitched. "Shouldn't?" Sawyer turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "I don't do this. I don't let people in." She stepped closer, voice steady. "You already have." His hands clenched at his sides. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because if I let myself want this, want you, there's no going back." Violet's gaze softened, and for the first time since meeting her, Sawyer felt completely exposed. She reached for his hand, fingers brushing against his. "Then don't go back." It was the simplest thing in the world, and the hardest, because the truth was he didn't want to. Sawyer had spent years building walls around himself, careful and deliberate, ensuring no one got too close. But Violet had slipped through the cracks without him realizing, and now there was no pretending he didn't want her. She stood in front of him, eyes searching his face, waiting. She wasn't asking for promises, wasn't demanding anything at all. She was just there, steady and certain, offering him something he hadn't let himself believe he could have. He reached for her hand, curling his fingers around hers, grounding himself in the warmth of her touch. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or poetic words, but this was something real. Violet didn't pull away. Instead, she curled her fingers tighter around his, as if sealing something between them. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. That night, Sawyer sat on Violet's porch with her, their shoulders brushing as they watched the stars blink to life in the dark sky. The air was thick with things unsaid, but for once, he wasn't afraid of silence. When Violet finally turned to him, her expression was open, unguarded. "You don't have to be afraid of this." Sawyer exhaled, tilting his head slightly toward her. "I'm not afraid of you." She studied him, her gaze steady. "Then what?" He hesitated, then admitted, "I don't know how to do this." Violet's lips parted, and for a moment, she simply looked at him. Then, slowly, she reached for his other hand, holding both of them between hers. "We figure it out together." Sawyer's chest tightened, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was something else, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. He nodded, squeezing her hands gently. Violet smiled, and something inside him settled. Days passed, and the weight he had carried for so long began to lessen. He found himself lingering in her kitchen, fixing things that didn't need fixing just to have an excuse to stay. She started leaving the porch light on longer, as if waiting for him to show up. It was slow, easy, not rushed, not forced. Just them finding their way. One evening, as they sat on the worn wooden steps of her porch, Violet leaned her head against his shoulder. Sawyer didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment, afraid she might pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she sighed softly. "I think I finally feel at home." Sawyer turned his head slightly, pressing his lips against her hair. "Me too." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it.